The quiet before the storm. David Marshall, a distinguished man in his early 40s, had spent most of his life serving justice in silence. To his daughter, Maya, he was simply Dad, her hero, her storyteller, her rock. On this rare Sunday afternoon, the two ventured out on their weekly walk, a tradition Maya cherished more than anything. The suburban neighborhood they strolled through was picturesque, with tree-lined streets and manicured lawns that seemed to promise peace and safety. Maya, an inquisitive 10-year-old, skipped along the sidewalk, her dark curls bouncing with each step. She held tightly to her father's hand, her small fingers laced with his. David was a man of few words, but with Maya, he could talk for hours. Today's conversation revolved around stars and space, her current obsession. "Do you think there are planets with people like us, Dad?" she asked, her voice bubbling with curiosity. David chuckled. "Maybe not exactly like us, but who knows? The universe is full of surprises." Their laughter mingled with the gentle rustle of leaves, a sound that should have signified peace. But peace, as David had learned over the years, was often fleeting. As they turned the corner near the neighborhood park, a police cruiser rolled up beside them, its presence intrusive in the otherwise tranquil setting. David noticed the car before Maya did, his years of training as an FBI agent kicking in. He didn't tense but became more alert, his grip on Maya's hand tightening slightly. The cruiser's window rolled down, and a middle-aged officer with a hardened expression leaned out. His eyes were sharp, his voice sharp. "What are you two doing here?" David stopped, his posture calm but firm. "Taking a walk. Is there a problem?" The officer's gaze swept over them, lingering on their intertwined hands. "You live around here?" he asked, his tone dripping with suspicion. "Yes," David replied, his voice steady. "We live just a few blocks away." The officer's lips curled into a skeptical smile. "Funny. I've never seen you around. What house?" Maya, sensing the tension, looked up at her father. "Dad, what's wrong?" David glanced down at her, his expression softening. "It's okay, sweetheart." He turned back to the officer. "I don't think we owe you an explanation for walking in our own neighborhood." The officer's face darkened. He stepped out of the car, his boots crunching against the gravel. His hand hovered near his belt, resting on his baton. "I think you do. People like you don't usually belong in neighborhoods like this." The words hit like a slap. David's jaw clenched, but he forced himself to remain calm. "We have every right to be here." The officer took a step closer, towering over them. "Where are you really coming from?" David's instincts screamed at him to de-escalate, but a quiet fury burned in his chest. "We're coming from home," he said firmly. "You can check your records if you'd like." The officer sneered. "Don't get smart with me. I'm asking the questions here." Maya, confused and frightened, clung to her father's side. "We're not doing anything wrong," she said softly, her voice trembling. The officer's gaze snapped to her, his eyes narrowing. "Don't talk back to me, little girl." David immediately stepped in front of Maya, shielding her. "That's enough. She's just a child." But the officer's disdain only grew. He shoved David backward with a force that sent him stumbling. Before David could react, the officer reached for Maya, gripping her arm roughly. She cried out in pain and fear. David's training kicked in. He fought the urge to retaliate immediately, knowing the consequences. Instead, he said, "Let her go. Right now." The officer ignored him, his grip tightening. "Maybe you need to teach her some respect." David's fists clenched at his sides as Maya began to cry. "She doesn't need to learn anything from someone like you." The officer released Maya with a shove, causing her to fall to the ground. Her knees scraped against the pavement, blood seeping through her tights. David rushed to her side, his heart pounding with a mix of rage and helplessness. The officer, baton now drawn, loomed over them. "You want to keep talking back? I'll have you both arrested for trespassing." David locked eyes with the officer, his voice low and steady. "This isn't over." The officer smirked, his confidence unshaken. He returned to his cruiser and drove off, leaving David and Maya bruised, both physically and emotionally. As David helped Maya to her feet, her tears streaming down her face, he made a silent vow. This wasn't just an act of random cruelty. It was part of a larger system he had fought against his entire career. What the officer didn't know was that David wasn't just any man. He was a federal agent with the power and the knowledge to bring people like him to justice. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. Beneath the surface, David cradled Maya's trembling hand as they made their way home. The bright autumn sun that had once seemed inviting now felt glaring, exposing them to a world that refused to accept their peace. Maya's tears had subsided, but her small voice broke the silence. "Why did he hurt us, Daddy?" she asked, her voice quivering. David knelt beside her, his heart aching at the sight of her scraped knees and tear-streaked face. Sometimes people let fear and hate guide them instead of kindness. But you don't need to worry. I'll make sure this never happens again. Maya nodded slowly, her trust in him unwavering. He carried her the rest of the way home, each step fueling his resolve. This wasn't the first time he had faced such blatant prejudice, but never had it come for his daughter. That was the line, and that line had been crossed. Back at their modest but well-kept house, David set Maya on the kitchen counter and retrieved the first aid kit. As he cleaned her wounds, her curiosity returned, though her voice was subdued. "Will that man come back?" she asked. "No," David said, his tone resolute. "He won't." Maya frowned, her young mind trying to process the injustice. But he didn't even say sorry. David paused. Some people don't realize they've done wrong until they're made to see it. Later that evening, after tucking Maya into bed, David retreated to his study. The room was a sanctuary of order, shelves lined with books on law enforcement and justice, a desk strewn with case files and photographs from his FBI work. Tonight, it would serve as the starting point for a different kind of case, one he hadn't anticipated but was now determined to see through. He opened his laptop and began piecing together the encounter. The officer's face, his badge number, the make and model of the cruiser, details David had committed to memory, as was second nature for someone in his line of work. He filed an incident report with the local precinct, attaching a note that the case required immediate review. But he didn't stop there. David knew all too well how easily complaints could disappear into bureaucratic voids. He made a few phone calls to colleagues, trusted individuals who understood the stakes of such cases. Among them was Agent Sarah Rodriguez, an old friend and civil rights investigator. "What's going on, David?" Sarah asked after hearing his account. "You've never called me this late." "It's personal this time," David said, his voice tight. "I need to know everything about this officer, his record, his connections, anything that could explain why he's still on the force." Sarah hesitated. "This sounds serious. You know how messy these things can get." David's voice hardened. "I don't care how messy it gets. He crossed a line, Sarah. I won't let him get away with it." There was a pause. Then Sarah sighed. "All right. Send me what you have, and I'll start digging." Over the next few days, David balanced his professional responsibilities with his personal mission. By day, he handled federal cases with the precision and composure that had earned him respect in his field. By night, he unraveled the officer's history piece by piece. What he discovered was damning. The officer, Sergeant Paul Huxley, had a long history of complaints, excessive force, racial profiling, intimidation tactics. Yet none of the allegations had ever stuck. Each one had been quietly dismissed, with no disciplinary action taken. David's jaw tightened as he read through the records. It was a pattern he recognized all too well, a system designed to protect its own, no matter the cost to the people it was supposed to serve. But this time, Huxley had targeted the wrong man. David's investigation revealed more than just Huxley's personal misconduct. He uncovered evidence of a culture within the department that tolerated, even encouraged, such behavior. Officers with similar complaints had received promotions instead of reprimands. Whistleblowers had been ostracized or forced out. David knew this wasn't just about Huxley anymore. It was about dismantling a system that allowed men like him to thrive. One evening, as David sifted through his findings, his phone buzzed with a call from Sarah. "I've got something for you," she said. "Huxley's protected, but his shields aren't invincible. Turns out, there's an ongoing DOJ inquiry into corruption in the precinct. They're looking for someone to corroborate their case." David leaned back in his chair, the pieces of his plan falling into place. Good. It's time to make sure Huxley's name is at the top of that list. Sarah hesitated. "Are you sure you're ready for this? It could get ugly." David's voice was steady. "It already got ugly when he put his hands on my daughter. I won't let him or anyone else think they can do that without consequences." By the end of the week, David had assembled a dossier of evidence, a timeline of Huxley's offenses, testimonies from others who had suffered under his authority, and documentation of the systemic issues within the department. It was a damning case, one that could not be ignored. David knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy. Challenging a system that protected its own was like swimming against a tide. But he had something Huxley didn't: truth, integrity, and a relentless determination to ensure justice was served. As David stared at the dossier, ready to send it to the DOJ, he thought of Maya sleeping peacefully upstairs. This fight wasn't just for her. It was for every child who deserved to walk through their neighborhood without fear, for every parent who shouldn't have to explain why the world was unjust, and for every person who had been told they didn't belong. David hit send. The battle had begun. Shadows of resistance. The days following David's submission to the Department of Justice, DOJ, were tense but purposeful. He had set events in motion that could not be undone, and the stakes were higher than ever. While he continued his FBI duties during the day, his evenings were consumed by this deeply personal crusade. His focus was unwavering, but he knew he couldn't do it alone. David reached out to others, neighbors, community members, and former colleagues. Many had stories of their own encounters with officers like Paul Huxley. These accounts varied in severity, but a pattern was clear. The abuse of power, cloaked in the guise of law and order, was pervasive and systemic. One evening, David met with a local journalist, Claire Donovan, whose investigative work on police misconduct had gained traction in recent months. They met at a small, dimly lit diner away from prying eyes. Claire had a reputation for exposing corruption, and David believed she could amplify the voices of those who had been silenced. Claire leaned forward, her notepad open. "So, you're telling me this Huxley guy has a rap sheet longer than most criminals, and he's still on the force?" David nodded. "That's exactly what I'm saying. And he's not the only one. He's part of a culture that protects itself at all costs." Claire's pen danced across the paper as she listened. "You've got evidence to back this up." David slid a flash drive across the table. "Everything you need is on here. Complaints, dismissed cases, internal memos. It's airtight." Claire picked up the drive, her expression resolute. "If this checks out, it's going to make waves. But you know they'll come after you, right? This isn't just a story. It's a war." David's jaw tightened. "Let them come. I've faced worse than Huxley and his cronies. This time, they won't win." Meanwhile, Maya began to notice the subtle changes in her father. He was still the same loving dad who told her bedtime stories and helped with her homework, but there was a heaviness about him, a weight he carried silently. She didn't fully understand what had happened with the officer, but she knew it had hurt her father as much as it had hurt her. One evening, as David was reviewing case files, Maya entered his study with a drawing in hand. It was a simple picture of the two of them walking hand in hand, with the words, "I love you, Daddy," scrawled in colorful crayon. David smiled as she handed it to him. "What's this for, sweetheart?" "It's for you," she said, climbing onto his lap. "Because you make me feel safe." David hugged her tightly, his resolve hardening. "I'll always keep you safe, Maya. That's a promise." As David's case gained momentum, resistance began to surface. Anonymous threats appeared in his mailbox, warning him to back off. His car was keyed, and late-night phone calls disrupted the quiet of their home. It was clear that someone wanted him to stop, but David was undeterred. He installed security cameras around his property and briefed Maya on safety precautions. "If anything ever feels wrong, you call me or your Uncle Steve." "Okay." Maya nodded solemnly. "Okay, Daddy." Despite the threats, David pressed on. He coordinated with Sarah and other allies within the DOJ, ensuring that the investigation into Huxley and the precinct was airtight. He also worked with Claire, providing her with verified information to publish a series of damning articles. The stories quickly gained attention, sparking outrage and calls for reform from the community. One night, as David was finalizing details for a DOJ meeting, he heard a loud knock at his door. He opened it to find Paul Huxley standing on his porch, his expression dark and menacing. "What do you want?" David asked, his voice calm but firm. Huxley stepped closer, his posture aggressive. "I know what you're doing, Marshall. You think you can come after me and not face consequences." David didn't flinch. "I'm not coming after you, Huxley. I'm exposing the truth. If you're afraid of consequences, that's your problem." Huxley's face twisted with anger. "You don't know who you're messing with." David stepped forward, his voice cold and deliberate. "Actually, I know exactly who I'm dealing with. And I know how this ends, with justice. Now, if you don't leave my property, I'll have you arrested for trespassing." For a moment, the two men stood in silence, the tension crackling like static electricity. Then Huxley turned and walked away, muttering under his breath. David watched him go, his fists clenched at his sides. This was no longer just a fight for justice. It was personal. The following day, David met with the DOJ team to present the final pieces of his case. Sarah was there, along with a team of federal prosecutors and investigators. As he laid out the evidence, the room fell silent, the weight of the corruption evident in every detail. When he finished, Sarah looked at him with a mixture of admiration and concern. "This is solid, David, but you need to be careful. They'll come after you harder now." David nodded. "I'm ready for whatever comes." As David left the meeting, he felt a sense of purpose that hadn't been there before. He wasn't just fighting for himself or Maya. He was fighting for every family that had been targeted, every voice that had been silenced. The battle wasn't over, but the tide was beginning to turn. And David Marshall wasn't about to stop until justice was served, a reckoning in motion. David knew the walls of power didn't crumble overnight. Patience, strategy, and persistence were key. As the days turned into weeks, his fight against Sergeant Paul Huxley and the corrupt system that shielded him intensified. The case was no longer just about one man's misconduct, but about exposing an entrenched culture of abuse and complicity. The media storm ignited by Claire Donovan's articles had placed the precinct under a glaring spotlight. Community protests erupted, with citizens demanding accountability. Justice for all signs dotted the streets, and the voices of those who had once been silenced rang loud and clear. Behind the curtain, David's quiet demeanor masked a man in constant motion. By day, he managed his official FBI assignments, ensuring his personal crusade didn't interfere with his professional integrity. By night, he sifted through witness accounts, departmental reports, and leaked emails that revealed the precinct's inner workings. He wasn't alone. Claire's exposes had inspired others to come forward, former officers who had left the department in frustration, victims of racial profiling, and even a few active-duty officers fed up with the status quo. Each new piece of evidence added weight to the growing case. But with momentum came pushback. Huxley wasn't idle. He had allies in the department and beyond, men who saw David's crusade as a threat to their unchecked power. Subtle intimidation escalated into outright harassment. One evening, David returned home to find his car's tires slashed. Another morning, a brick was thrown through his window, narrowly missing Maya's room. David reported each incident, though he knew the likelihood of action from local authorities was slim. Instead, he doubled down on his security measures, reinforcing his home and keeping a vigilant watch over Maya. The breaking point. The situation came to a head one evening during a community town hall. Organized by local leaders, the event was intended to address the growing tensions between the police department and the citizens they served. David attended not as an agent, but as a concerned father and resident. The town hall was packed, standing room only. Faces of every age and background filled the space, unified by a shared demand for justice. On the stage sat city officials, police representatives, and community advocates. Huxley, conspicuously absent, had sent a representative in his place. David watched from the back, arms crossed, as one speaker after another recounted their experiences. A young man shared how he had been stopped and frisked outside his own home. An elderly woman described being dismissed when she reported harassment. Each story was a thread, weaving a tapestry of systemic failure. When the moderator called for more speakers, David stepped forward. The room hushed as he took the microphone, his tall, commanding presence drawing every eye. "My name is David Marshall," he began. "Many of you know me as a neighbor, a friend, or maybe just as Maya's dad. But tonight, I'm here as someone who has spent 2 decades fighting for justice on a federal level. And I'm here to tell you that what we're facing isn't just a few bad apples. It's a broken tree." A murmur rippled through the crowd. "I've seen the evidence," David continued. "I've spoken to victims, reviewed reports, and uncovered patterns of behavior that are not isolated incidents. They are systemic, and I promise you, change is coming." Applause erupted, but not everyone was pleased. As David returned to his seat, he noticed a group of officers in uniform near the exit. Their expressions ranged from cold indifference to open hostility. One of them muttered something to his colleague, and they both laughed. David's jaw tightened. He wasn't afraid, but he was more determined than ever. The unseen ally. That night, after the town hall, David received an unexpected visitor. As he reviewed files in his study, a knock echoed through the quiet house. Peering through the peephole, he saw a figure in civilian clothes, a young man with nervous eyes. David opened the door cautiously. "Can I help you?" The man hesitated. "You don't know me, but I work at the precinct. My name's Officer Torres." David studied him, noting the man's uneasy demeanor. "What are you doing here, Torres?" Torres glanced over his shoulder. "I've been reading the articles, watching the protests. I can't stay quiet anymore. I have information, documents, recordings, things you'll want to see." David stepped aside, gesturing for him to enter. Once inside, Torres handed over a folder and a flash drive. "This is everything I've collected over the past year. I've seen things, Agent Marshall, things that make me ashamed to wear the badge." David took the items, his gratitude tempered by caution. "Why now?" Torres looked down, guilt etched across his face. "Because I've been complicit. I stood by and did nothing. But I'm done being a bystander." David nodded. "This is a brave step, Torres. But it's also dangerous. If you're serious about this, I'll make sure you're protected." Torres nodded. "I just want to do the right thing." The tipping point. The evidence Torres provided was explosive. Secret audio recordings captured senior officers discussing ways to suppress complaints and protect one another. Internal memos revealed deliberate efforts to target specific communities. And there, in the center of it all, was Paul Huxley. David worked through the night, organizing the materials and sending copies to Sarah and Claire. By morning, the story had grown legs of its own. News outlets across the country picked up the latest revelations, and the DOJ announced an official inquiry into the precinct. For David, the battle was far from over, but the tide was turning. Huxley and his allies had underestimated the strength of a man fueled by love for his daughter and a lifelong commitment to justice. As David watched Maya play in their backyard, her laughter cutting through the morning air, he felt a renewed sense of purpose. He wasn't just fighting for her future. He was fighting for a world where no child would ever have to ask, "Why did they hurt us?" Justice was no longer a distant ideal. It was within reach, and David Marshall wouldn't stop until it was firmly in hand. The noose tightens. The morning after the DOJ inquiry was announced, the precinct was a hive of tension and whispers. Officers avoided eye contact, and the once cocky Sergeant Paul Huxley seemed less sure of himself. The news was everywhere: corruption, cover-ups, and abuse of power. David Marshall's name wasn't mentioned explicitly in the reports, but the community knew he was the driving force behind the revelations. Huxley, however, wasn't ready to go down quietly. Desperation breeds recklessness. At a coffee shop across town, Huxley sat with two of his closest allies, Officers Grant and Wheeler. The trio had worked together for years, building a tight circle of influence within the precinct. Huxley's voice was low, but edged with fury. "This Marshall guy thinks he can destroy us," he hissed. "But he doesn't know who he's dealing with." Grant shifted uncomfortably. "Paul, the DOJ is breathing down our necks. The press is all over this. Maybe it's time to lay low." "Lay low," Huxley snapped. "This isn't just about me. If he takes me down, you're next. You think they'll stop with one man?" Wheeler nodded reluctantly. "What's the plan, then?" Huxley leaned in, his expression dark. "We remind him who's in control. If he wants a fight, we'll give him one." A warning that backfires. David's day began with another meeting at the DOJ. The evidence collected from Officer Torres had bolstered their case, and federal investigators were now taking an active role in dismantling the corruption within the precinct. As David left the building, his phone buzzed with a notification. It was a text message from an unknown number. The words were chilling. "Drop this, or you'll regret it. You have a family to think about." David's lips pressed into a thin line as he stared at the screen. Threats like these weren't new to him. His years in the FBI had prepared him for such intimidation tactics. But this time, the stakes were personal. He immediately forwarded the message to Sarah, who promised to escalate the matter with federal cybersecurity experts. "We'll trace it," she assured him. "But you need to be extra careful." David nodded. "I always am." An uneasy calm. That evening, David tried to maintain a sense of normalcy for Maya. They cooked dinner together, her giggles filling the kitchen as she attempted to crack eggs without spilling the yolks. For a few hours, the weight of the case faded into the background, replaced by the warmth of their shared laughter. But even as they ate, David's mind was elsewhere. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was coming. A retaliation from Huxley and his allies, desperate to protect themselves as the walls closed in. The turning point. The following day, David received a call from Claire Donovan. "You're not going to believe this," she said, her voice electric with urgency. "I got an anonymous tip. Someone just leaked a video of Huxley." David's grip on the phone tightened. "What kind of video?" "Bodycam footage," Claire replied. "It shows him and a couple of other officers harassing a family outside their home. It's bad, David. Real bad." Within hours, the footage was circulating online. The video showed Huxley and two other officers confronting a black family in their driveway. The family's calm explanations were met with aggression and threats, culminating in the officers forcing the father to the ground while his children screamed in the background. The public outrage was immediate. Protests swelled in size, with demands for Huxley's resignation and the firing of all involved officers. News outlets ran the footage on a loop, and the pressure on the precinct reached a boiling point. The breaking of Huxley. By the end of the week, Huxley's name was synonymous with abuse of power. The DOJ inquiry expanded, and more officers began coming forward with evidence of corruption. Huxley's allies, sensing the inevitable, started distancing themselves. In a desperate attempt to salvage his reputation, Huxley held a press conference. Standing at a podium surrounded by his remaining supporters, he declared his innocence, blaming the media and activist agendas for tarnishing his name. But his performance only fueled the fire. Moments after the press conference ended, another leak surfaced, emails between Huxley and his superiors, discussing ways to suppress complaints and intimidate whistleblowers. David watched the chaos unfold with a mixture of satisfaction and caution. He knew the fight wasn't over, but Huxley's power was crumbling. The noose was tightening, and soon there would be no escape. The call to action. That night, David received a call from Sarah. "The DOJ is ready to move forward with charges," she said. "But we need one final piece, a public testimony. We need you, David." David leaned back in his chair, the weight of the request settling over him. Testifying would mean stepping into the spotlight, exposing himself and Maya to even more scrutiny and potential danger. But it would also mean delivering the final blow to a system that had caused so much harm. "I'll do it," he said, his voice steady. "Let's finish this." As David hung up the phone, he looked out the window at the quiet street below. The fight had been long and grueling, but the end was in sight. Huxley's reign of fear was nearly over, and justice, true justice, was within reach. Justice delivered. The courtroom was packed. Spectators, reporters, community members, and supporters had filled every seat, the air thick with anticipation. Cameras clicked furiously as David Marshall entered, his calm, stoic demeanor masking the storm of emotions underneath. He wasn't here for revenge. He was here for justice. At the center of the storm was Paul Huxley, seated at the defense table. The once confident officer now looked like a man unraveling. His shoulders sagged, and his eyes darted nervously around the room. The mountain of evidence against him had grown insurmountable, and this trial was the culmination of it all. David took his seat near the front, his testimony expected to be the linchpin in the case. Beside him sat his attorney and his longtime ally, Sarah Rodriguez, who had been instrumental in coordinating the DOJ's investigation. Behind him, Maya sat with a trusted family friend, her small hand clutching a stuffed animal for comfort. She didn't fully understand the gravity of the trial, but she knew her father was fighting for something important. The testimony. When David was called to the stand, the room fell silent. He rose, adjusted his suit jacket, and walked to the witness box with measured steps. After being sworn in, he sat, his eyes locking briefly with Huxley's before turning to the prosecuting attorney. "Agent Marshall," the prosecutor began, "can you describe the events that led to your involvement in this case?" David recounted the harrowing encounter with Huxley in vivid detail. He described the officer's disdain, his aggression, and the moment he shoved Maya to the ground. His voice remained steady, but the underlying emotion was palpable. The jury leaned in, captivated. "And what action did you take afterward?" the prosecutor asked. David explained how he had documented the encounter, gathered evidence, and connected the dots between Huxley's behavior and a larger pattern of corruption. He spoke of the brave individuals who had come forward, risking their safety to expose the truth. "Agent Marshall," the prosecutor said, "why did you choose to pursue this case so relentlessly?" David paused, his gaze sweeping the room. "Because no one, no child, no parent, no human being, should ever feel unsafe in their own community. And because the people who abuse their power must be held accountable." The defense's desperation. When the defense attorney cross-examined David, it was clear they were grasping at straws. They attempted to paint him as biased, suggesting his position as an FBI agent had influenced the investigation. But David remained composed, dismantling their arguments with the precision of a seasoned professional. "Do you believe you acted out of personal vendetta?" the defense attorney asked, their tone accusatory. David's response was firm. "I acted out of a commitment to justice. If holding someone accountable for their actions is considered a vendetta, then perhaps you misunderstand the meaning of justice. The verdict. Over the next several days, the trial unfolded with damning evidence presented at every turn. Witness after witness testified against Huxley, recounting stories of intimidation, harassment, and violence. The leaked bodycam footage and emails were the final nails in the coffin. When the jury returned with their verdict, the tension in the room was palpable. The foreperson rose, her voice steady as she read the decision. On the charges of abuse of power, racial discrimination, and conspiracy to obstruct justice, we find the defendant, Paul Huxley, guilty. A wave of relief and quiet cheers rippled through the room. Huxley's face fell, his once defiant demeanor replaced by the hollow realization of his fate. The aftermath. Outside the courthouse, the atmosphere was electric. Supporters gathered, holding signs that read "Justice for all" and "No more silence." David emerged to applause and gratitude, though his focus remained on Maya, who ran to him and wrapped her arms around his waist. "Did we win, Daddy?" she asked, her eyes wide. David knelt down, looking into her innocent face. "We did, sweetheart. We won." A legacy of change. In the weeks that followed, the repercussions of the trial were far-reaching. Huxley's conviction sent shockwaves through the precinct, leading to the resignation of several senior officers and the implementation of sweeping reforms. New policies emphasized accountability and transparency, and a civilian oversight board was established to prevent future abuses. David returned to his FBI work, but his life had changed. He became a prominent advocate for justice and equality, speaking at community events and mentoring young activists. His story inspired others to stand up, to fight back, and to believe in the possibility of change. For Maya, the world seemed a little brighter. She saw her father not just as her hero, but as a hero for others, a man who had turned pain into purpose, fear into courage, and injustice into accountability. As David watched Maya play in the park one sunny afternoon, her laughter ringing out like music, he felt a deep sense of peace. The fight had been long and arduous, but it had been worth it. Because justice wasn't just a concept, it was something you fought for, something you lived for. And in that moment, watching his daughter run free, David knew they had not only changed their own lives, but had laid the foundation for a better future. One where no child would have to ask, "Why did they hurt us?" again.